What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. In today's video, I'll be breaking down the draft decision between Melvin Gordon, David Johnson, and James Conner. This is a decision that a lot of you are going to need to make in that late third to early fourth round range, because we do target running back in this range pretty heavily. These are three running backs I do have listed as targets. Spoiler alert, I like all of them. So you're going to be looking at this grouping and you're probably going to need to make this exact decision. So I'm very excited that you guys picked this one, because it was honestly a decision I was struggling to rank as well. So we'll see at the end of the video how I rank all these players. And make sure also in each of these breakdowns, I'm just picking your top option. So if you have another point in the draft that I have not gone over already that you want a decision on, put that in the comment section, upvote your favorite ones, and I will try to find a day to upload whatever you guys pick as the top option. But for today, let's start things off with the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was which running back ranked dead last in yards over a replacement level player. The answer was Peyton Barber. For today's stat, from week 7 on last season, the top 6 wide receivers in points per game in half PPR scoring were Michael Thomas, Mike Evans, DeAndre Hopkins, Parker, Julio, Adams, and who was 7th? And no, this wasn't like a player who played like 1 or 2 games. This player actually was involved in the second half of the season. So over from week 7 on, those are the top 6 wide receivers points per game. Who was 7th? So guys, let us start this breakdown. And the first thing I really want to go over is the injuries, right? This breakdown is unique because each of these players does have a few different individual risk factors and different levels of unknown for all of them. But at the end of the day, a lot of people are scared to draft these 3 specific players because of the injuries. A little bit less with Melvin Gordon, which I will go over this, but I felt it was really good to just start off this video getting that out of the way, talking about the injury situations of all 3 backs, so that we just have a holistic view right off the bat. So I am going to start with Melvin Gordon. He missed 9 games since 2015 with torn knee cartilage, a hip sprain, a hamstring strain, and an MCL sprain. And then he's been on the injury report but hasn't missed time with separate ankle injury, ankle sprain of course, a knee sprain, shoulder strain, and then a foot strain, and then another knee strain. So he's had a bunch of different strains, little injuries. But one thing I want to point out with that is he's played through a lot of these. So he's injured his ankle, he's injured his knee, he's injured his shoulder. He's been able to just still come out, get on the field. He's had some more major injuries that have held him out for decent chunks of time, but nothing that I'm looking at like, oh, he's torn an ACL twice in the same leg, right? He has no huge things. And one thing for him that has been a positive has been the timing. He's similar to Chris Carson, where a lot of those injuries, they've come at the end of the season. So he hasn't missed a ton of games, even though some of the injuries were a little bit more major than the games missed look like. So this is, I guess, a positive for fantasy, not necessarily a positive for his health. Right, so if he suffers these exact same injuries a little earlier in the season, he doesn't miss 9 weeks. He maybe misses closer to 15. Ultimately, like I said to start, of these 3 players, I am the least concerned with Melvin Gordon. Sports Injury Predictor has him only missing 1.5 weeks, which isn't super high. And they do have Phillip Lindsay, who of course we're going to talk about. So he's not going to get 350 touches, right? Like Melvin Gordon would be a much riskier player as far as injuries are concerned if Phillip Lindsay and Royce Freeman, they're just both not there and it's only Melvin Gordon. Well, yeah, he's got a better chance of getting hurt. But since Lindsay can't keep him fresh, I think that's going to increase the chance that he stays healthy this season. Moving on to James Conner, I consider him the second riskiest in the group as far as injuries are concerned. He missed a few weeks in 2018 with an ankle injury, but then 6 weeks last season with an AC joint sprain and a quad contusion. And he also did show up on the injury report, but didn't miss any time with a concussion, a knee sprain, an ankle sprain, and a separate quad strain. And this is all in the last 2 seasons. Player Profiler actually gives him the greatest chance of any running back to suffer an injury this season, which of course is not ideal. But I will say this. He's fully healthy as of recording this, and like I'll get to later in this video, they drafted Anthony McFarland to try and keep James Conner healthy, so I don't expect them to just run him into the ground, because if that happens, he's probably going to get hurt. Like, there's a reason Player Profiler has him with the highest chance of injury. He's a big risk. But since they got Anthony McFarland, I think that's going to lower the risk this season because they don't need to give him the ball on every play. That'll give him a better chance of staying healthy. Finally, we do have David Johnson. He's missed 19 games since 2014 with a shoulder, wrist, back, and ankle injuries. But two notes on that. I said 19 games, right? Well, 15 of those came with the dislocated wrist. So it's not like they were even amounts of time with the shoulder, the wrist, the back, the ankle. A good chunk of them came on one injury that he suffered right at the beginning of the season. So he's only actually missed 4 games outside of that since 2014. However, while he only missed 2 games last season with the ankle injury, it was pretty clear that he wasn't able to play in a few that he was actually active for, or at least, pretty clear after kickoff, not going into kickoff with that whole debacle. But I did want to say that I view him as the highest injury risk of this group. Sports Injury Predictor has him with 3.4 projected games missed, which is pretty decent. Player Profiler has him with the 12th highest odds to suffer an injury. Plus, I do think they're going to feed him a ton of touches. So I think he gets the most touches of this group, and since he's also got a decent chance of getting injury on each touch, I view him as the highest risk. I don't think it's like some massive gap where it's like David Johnson's up here, and then it's like a huge drop off into James Conner, and then to Gordon. I think it's DJ at the top, James Conner a little bit below him, and then I do think it's a little bit of a gap between those two and Gordon. So I think that's a little bit closer between them. So we'll circle back around to the injuries when we go over each player's risk, but let's do some individual breakdowns now. So we'll start with Melvin Gordon. Gordon was incredibly unlucky with touchdowns in his rookie season, scoring 0 times on 217 touches. But as we know, touchdowns can be extremely volatile year over year. So he followed up his 0 with 12, 12, 14, and 9 touchdowns over the next 4 seasons on touch counts of 295, 342, 225, 204. Of course, with the 204 last season, he did hold out for a bit, so that's why it's a little bit lower. While catching at least 40 balls in all 4 seasons. So we know he's getting touchdowns. We know he's catching the ball out of the backfield. So when you've got a player who is involved in basically every aspect of the game, they're going to produce in fantasy, and that's what we've seen over the last 4 years. He's been the running back 5, 7, 3, and then 16 last season in points per game. So given that he's going on average as a running back 17, we're getting a significant discount over what he's done in the past. So why are we getting this discount? Well, of course, he changed teams. He's moving from the Chargers to the Broncos, which is definitely a downgrade, especially in the screen game. Rivers is one of the best screen game quarterbacks in the NFL. So shifting to Drew Lock is going to hurt his reception upside. And the Broncos are only projected to win 7.5 games this season, which of course isn't ideal for high-end fantasy production from a running back. It is still fine. If they end up winning 7 to 8 games, you can still produce elite numbers. It's just slightly more difficult. But, he's shown that he can perform well on a team that's not winning a ton of games in the past. So I don't view that as a huge issue. I just did want to point out a lot of people are very excited about the Broncos this season. Don't hype them up too much. They still only are projected to win 7.5 games. This isn't a 10-win team. One positive on that front, though, I know I say don't hype them up too much. The offense does have some upside. So if Drew Lock performs, or I guess outperforms expectations this season, they could find themselves winning more games than we're expecting. Sutton's obviously a phenomenal wide receiver. Adding the duo of Judy and Hamler does give them a more dangerous wide receiver core. Pretty much everyone's expecting Fant to take a step forward. So, like I said, if Locke overperforms his expectations, they could have a pretty decent offense, and that's obviously a good thing for Melvin Gordon. The biggest question mark for Gordon is the touches. We know Freeman just isn't going to be used anymore if he even is on the team at the start of the season. So we should really only be looking to divide the work between Melvin Gordon and Phillip Lindsay. And if we look back to last season, Freeman had 132 carries, 43 receptions. Lindsay had 224 carries, 35 receptions. Given Melvin Gordon's contract, which is 2 years, $16 million, with 13.5 of that fully guaranteed, the most likely outcome is that Gordon is going to take over Lindsay's role. So remember, I just said 224 carries, about 35 receptions. And then Lindsay kind of shifts into the Freeman role, which was 132 carries, 43 receptions. I think that's pretty likely. It's possible that Gordon takes even more work than that, and we see a situation where maybe he has like 275 touches with around 40 of those coming through the air. I think that's not a terrible projection. So looking at about 235 carries, 40 receptions from Melvin Gordon, I think that is well within his range of outcomes and kind of like a median projection of what we should expect. And if you're wondering like a comp to that, Aaron Jones. Last season, that's like exactly the production I would expect from Melvin Gordon this year. Not the 19 touchdowns. I'm talking about just the carries and the receptions. So given that sort of volume, coming off the board as running back 17 on average, that is, a little bit of a discount. One thing I want to note on that, though, this is a projection, and we don't know. He's the only player in this group where I look at Phillip Lindsay and I say, sure, he could shift into the Freeman role, but that's not a guarantee. Phillip Lindsay is a good running back. Like, I know I talk about him being pretty bad in pass protection, and he was pretty inefficient in the receiving game, and that's just why they brought in Melvin Gordon, one of the better receiving backs. So I do still expect what I just said to happen with like 235 carries and 40 receptions. But I want to reiterate that Phillip Lindsay is not a bad running back, and they don't want to just completely shift all of this work to Melvin Gordon. So is there a chance that these guys are much closer to an even split? Absolutely, especially with a limited offseason. So I want to highlight that as a potential risk factor for Melvin Gordon, but then say, ultimately, if you made me choose an outcome, it's what I talked about with the touches. On to David Johnson. He comes off the board as running back 21 on average, but he's probably the most polarizing player of the three. Like I said, he does have the highest injury concern, and there are many people who will just not draft him because of that. And he's also changing teams just like Melvin Gordon is. David Johnson is also the oldest running back of the group. He's turning 29, whereas Melvin Gordon is 27, and then James Conner is 25. But the biggest controversy I see around him is how people view his talent and how much that matters. No one really argues that Melvin Gordon is a talented running back. That's pretty widely accepted. Pretty much everyone concludes that James Conner, he's a pretty good running back as well. But there's a whole community out there who thinks David Johnson is just dust. And while I don't believe that's true, it's not very difficult to see why people think that. He's averaged 3.6 and 3.7 yards per carry over the last 2 years, including 4.5 and 5.5 yards per touch, both not so great numbers. One issue I have with that is that it doesn't matter all that much in fantasy as long as we don't think it'll affect the volume. So if we have a player who's pretty inefficient and they have talented running backs behind them, or we think they might shift the workload to someone else if the inefficiency continues, then we have a problem, right? Because they're not a good running back, and we think the team is going to give that volume to someone else if they continue to be not that good. But even if you think David Johnson isn't all that great, no team has ever given Duke Johnson a role. It just hasn't happened. So I understand that he might be inefficient, but what else are they going to do? Right? Like, they just gave Carlos Hyde a billion carries over Duke Johnson, even though every single year Duke Johnson is incredibly efficient on a per touch basis. Teams just don't give him the ball. And so when you bring in David Johnson on a mega contract and trade away DeAndre Hopkins, they're not just going to be like, let's bench him for Duke. Now's the chance we give Duke the ball. Like last season, the Texans gave Carlos Hyde 255 touches and he gained 4.4 yards per touch and averaged 2.6 yards per target, which is embarrassingly low. And it shows he cannot be used in the receiving game. And this is something we really need to talk about. David Johnson is going to see more work than Carlos Hyde because Carlos Hyde is extremely limited as a player. And say what you want about David Johnson, he is a great receiving back. And the Texans are going to design plays to get him targets. And since no team, like I said, has ever been willing to feature Duke on the ground, we have to assume that David Johnson is aligned to pick up Carlos Hyde's 245 carries and be involved in the receiving game. And so it might sound aggressive, but 300 touches is well within his range of outcomes. And that's part of a high-scoring offense, so the touchdown upside is also high. I mean, Hyde was not that great last season, still gained over 1,000 yards and 6 rushing touchdowns. That's over 1,000 rushing yards, 6 rushing touchdowns. So that's kind of David Johnson's floor while he's healthy, and obviously the receiving ceiling is much higher than Hyde's was. Plus, David Johnson has been productive in fantasy when he's been given the touches. So even in these seasons that we're saying he's not that efficient, I mean, he was the running back 6 over the first 6 weeks last season before suffering the ankle injury. So given that, like I said, he's the 4th highest paid running back this season on this mega contract, and they lost DeAndre Hopkins to get him, there's just no way that they don't give him all the touches he can handle, which means he'll be really good in fantasy. But like I said, all the touches he can handle. There's a chance that they do the same thing that the Cardinals did last season. He gets a ton of touches for the first month to 2 months, and then he gets injured. It is nice that last season he was going in the mid-first, and now he goes late 3rd, early 4th round. I think I got him in like the 5th round in the Scott Fish Bowl. So he falls. He definitely falls later in drafts. And so while there's the risk, I love his ADP because he's going to get so many more touches than everyone else in that range, and the Texans are still a good offense. There's going to be touchdowns. Final player, before we talk about how I would rank all 3, is James Conner. This is going to be Conner's 4th season now, and he's finished as the running back 7 and 18 in points per game over the last 2 years, but we kind of need to take a closer look at those numbers. So he finishes as the running back 7 in 2018, but that was while averaging 19.4 points per game. And this was the running back 7 on a per game basis, which is much more important than overall. You want to know how players are performing when you actually start them. So 19.4 points per game in 2018. We bring that into last season. So remember, that's the running back 7 in 2018. Well, last season, that only trails McCaffrey, Derrick Henry, Dalvin Cook, Aaron Jones. They all had fewer points per game last season than James Conner did in 2018. So we transition into 2019, and it's not shocking that he's a top 10 pick everywhere. And while he wasn't dominating, he was still the running back 10 in points per game through week 8. And that was playing with mostly Mason Rudolph and Devlin Hodges. That's an obvious downgrade from Big Ben. And we saw how bad the offense became when they switched to these guys. Then in week 8 was when he suffers the AC joint sprain, and he was just never able to get healthy after that. But the fact is, when James Conner is healthy, he's running back 1. Benny Snell and Jalen Samuels are not the answer, right? Samuels averaged 2.7 yards per carry, and Snell can't catch. Conner is the unquestioned leader in the backfield among those returning. The only question is Anthony McFarland. However, McFarland was a 4th round pick, so they didn't use too much draft capital to get him. His athletic measurements are fine, but nothing special. And he's only 5'8", 208 pounds. He just profiles much more as a change of pace back, not someone they want to be like, oh, if Connor got hurt, we're giving him 30 touches. That's not going to happen. If Connor got hurt, they're going to distribute those touches amongst a bunch of different people. They brought in McFarland to be a change of pace back and to keep James Conner healthy. I mean, even in college, we look at McFarland's touch totals, 138, 131. So expecting him to have like a ton more than that in his rookie season in this offseason, that's ridiculous, right? He's just not going to go over those numbers unless we have mass injuries on the Steelers. The most likely outcome is that the Steelers, they know Samuels and Snell just aren't that great, and so they took McFarland as an explosive option, to when they say, hey, we don't want to give James Conner 25 touches a game, let's scale him back into maybe the upper teens, and whenever we want an explosive back on the field, well, McFarland is extremely explosive. And a note on the draft capital. I know James Conner was also effectively a 4th round pick as well, but that's not the correct way of looking at it. We look at how teams view players based on contracts and on draft capital. And so them only spending a mid-4th round pick on McFarland shows that they didn't view running back as a big need. If they looked at James Conner and they said, we need a backup, we need someone who is absolutely going to help him carry the load, they're not spending a 4th round pick on him, right? The 4th round pick indicates that they just needed a little bit more depth. It's like Seattle drafting DJ Dallas, right? They took him in the late 4th round. That doesn't mean they like him more than Chris Carson, after taking Carson in the 7th. They just wanted to add a little bit of depth, especially with Penny likely opening the season on the pup. So that's just a quick take on draft capital in general. The 4th round pick on McFarland seems to be more depth related than trying to replace Connor. So that's my breakdown on these 3 running backs. Who would I draft? If the decision came down to running back and these 3 players, who am I picking? In my eyes, injury risk shouldn't play too much of a role in this decision. I know I say we avoid risk in the first 4 rounds, but you're usually in the 4th round with this pick, and so we care a little bit less than in the first 3. And it's not like the risk is just drastically different with all 3. I said David Johnson has the highest injury risk, but he's got the lowest volume risk. And then Melvin Gordon has the lowest injury risk, but the highest volume risk. So overall, I don't really think you can point to risk and say this guy over this guy. They all have their individual factors, and so I think you need to just look at who do we expect to produce more on a per game basis when they're all healthy. And for me, the winner is James Conner. He's not changing teams. And his situation is actually improving from last season. They should have a phenomenal defense. They should have a very high-scoring offense. He's proven to be a running back 1 whenever he's healthy. The choice between Gordon and Johnson is very close, but I lean Johnson here. While I think Gordon gets a good portion of the work, we can't just ignore Phillip Lindsay. He does have over 1,200 yards and at least 7 touchdowns in each of his first 2 seasons. So while Gordon will outtouch him, we can't know for sure by how much he will outtouch him. But we do know the volume is gonna be there for David Johnson, and he's also gonna be on the better offense between the 2 because, like I said, we expect the Broncos to be better. But I'm going to put my money on Watson over Locke. Even losing Hopkins, I think the Texans are going to be the better offense between them and the Broncos. So I would rank them James Conner at the top, then David Johnson, then Melvin Gordon, but all are ranked as targets on the site. And if you can get multiple of them, do it. So that's it for this breakdown. If you have any other breakdowns you want to see me go over, then leave them in the comment section down below. And if you want to see my exact rankings on all players, you can view that at our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. That's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting that like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? But thanks for watching.